The chime of the supermarket doorbell rang softly as Morgan Freeman stepped inside. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold, scanning the aisles with a quiet, thoughtful gaze. It was a small, unassuming grocery store in a southern town, the kind where everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. He wasn't here for anything in particular, just passing through, looking for something simple, maybe a loaf of bread, a memory of home. A young black mother, Danielle, stood at the checkout counter, balancing a toddler on her hip as she counted out change for a few groceries. Her hands moved quickly, nervously, her breath coming in short, quiet bursts. James, the cashier, a wiry, sharp-eyed man in his late 30s, watched her with barely concealed disdain. His lips curled slightly as he tapped his fingers against the counter, impatient, disapproving. "You sure you have enough for all that?" he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Morgan paused mid-step, his fingers grazing a loaf of bread on the shelf. The tension was unmistakable. He had seen this moment before, too many times. A young mother just trying to make it through. The day, a man behind the counter using power in the smallest, meanest way possible. The way the woman shrank slightly, pressing her child closer, told him this wasn't the first time. The store had grown quieter, eyes flicking toward the scene, but quickly looking away. Morgan took a slow breath, placed the bread back on the shelf, and turned toward the counter. Not today, he thought. Not this time. Danielle fumbled with the last of her coins, her fingers trembling as she placed a few quarters on the counter. "That should be enough," she said softly, her voice steady but tired. Her little boy clung to her shoulder, wide-eyed, sensing the tension but too young to understand. James scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah? Let's count and see." He dragged out the words, his voice laced with condescension, as he picked up each coin with deliberate slowness. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. The small crowd near the checkout line shuffled uncomfortably, pretending not to notice. No one spoke. Morgan watched, his expression unreadable. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, the casual, calculated kind, a man who enjoyed watching someone feel small. He exhaled quietly, stepping closer, but he didn't say anything yet. "Not yet." James clicked his tongue, shaking his head as he pushed 2 items aside. "Not enough. You'll have to put these back." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Danielle hesitated, then nodded, reaching for the baby formula, the most expensive item in her cart. Morgan moved, but not toward James. Morgan didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice, didn't confront James. Instead, he reached for a pack of gum from the nearby display and placed it gently on the counter. "I'll take this," he said, his voice smooth, unhurried. James barely glanced at him. "That all?" he muttered, still fixated on Danielle, waiting for her to put the baby formula back. Morgan nodded. Then, as James punched the keys on the register, Morgan slowly, deliberately reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a crisp $100 bill and placed it on the counter, right next to Danielle's coins. The room seemed to pause. The air shifted. James's smirk faltered. Danielle's breath caught in her throat. No one spoke, but suddenly the moment belonged to Morgan. Not because of the money, but because of the way he did it. Quiet. Undeniable. Unapologetic. James's fingers hovered over the register, his jaw tightening. "We don't take charity," he said, his voice clipped, his smirk gone. But there was something else beneath his words now, something uncertain. Danielle's lips parted, her eyes darting from Morgan to the bill on the counter. She looked as though she wanted to speak, to refuse, but the weight of exhaustion, of too many battles fought in silence, kept her still. Morgan tilted his head slightly, studying James with quiet patience. "Good thing this isn't charity." His voice was warm, steady, just an old man paying for his gum. A few murmurs rippled through the store. The moment had shifted. It was no longer James in control. He looked at Morgan, then at the other customers, at the eyes now watching him instead of Danielle. For the first time, James looked unsure. James exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers twitching against the counter. "You think this makes you some kind of hero?" His voice was lower now, just enough for those nearby to hear. The smirk was gone, replaced by something harder, something exposed. Morgan didn't flinch. He simply smiled, that slow, knowing smile that had weathered time, ignorance, and men like James before. He picked up the pack of gum and turned it over in his hands as if this moment wasn't about James at all. Danielle hesitated, her hands hovering over the baby formula. She looked at the money, at James, then at Morgan. Years of learned hesitation made her want to refuse, but the quiet ache of her child's needs made her fingers tremble toward acceptance. Someone coughed nearby. The silence in the store had stretched too long, too thick. The other customers weren't just bystanders anymore. They were watching, waiting. James could feel it, the control he had so easily wielded slipping away. Danielle's hands hovered over the bill, her breath unsteady. Accepting help meant admitting she needed it. And that was a battle she had fought her whole life, to stand on her own, to prove she was enough. But her child stirred against her, his small fingers curling into her jacket, reminding her what truly mattered. James saw her hesitation and latched onto it. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, go ahead, take his pity." His voice dripped, with something bitter, something personal. "Bet it feels real good." Morgan's gaze finally lifted, settling on James with quiet gravity. "Pity?" he echoed, almost amused. He shook his head slowly. "No, son. This is grace." The store felt different now. It wasn't just an argument at a checkout counter. It was something deeper. The quiet murmurs among the customers had grown. A few exchanged glances. Some nodded. And then, from somewhere in the back, a voice spoke. "Let the man help her." James's head snapped toward the voice. It came from an older woman near the produce aisle, her hands resting on her cart. She wasn't looking at James. She was looking at Danielle. And there was something in her eyes that wasn't pity, but recognition. Understanding. A few more murmurs rippled through the store. A man near the refrigerated section gave a small nod. A teenage cashier at another register froze mid-scan, her eyes darting between Morgan and James. The energy had shifted. James felt it. His fingers curled into fists, his face tightening, as if the air itself had turned against him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had control here. He always had control here. But now, the room wasn't his anymore. Danielle took a shaky breath, then, with careful fingers, she picked up the $100 bill. The baby in her arms cooed softly, sensing the relief in his mother's grip. Morgan simply smiled. James' face darkened as Danielle clutched the bill. He couldn't stand it. The store, the people, turning against him, his control slipping like sand through his fingers. He had to take it back. With a sharp motion, he grabbed the baby formula off the counter and yanked it away. "Store policy," he said, voice tight. "I don't have to sell to people who make a scene." A collective gasp rippled through the store. Someone muttered, "That's not right." A man near the frozen section shifted uncomfortably, but no one moved. No one knew what to do. No one except Morgan. With the same unshakable calm, he stepped forward. He didn't grab the formula. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at James. And when he finally spoke, his words were quiet, but they hit like a hammer. "Is this who you want to be?" James flinched, just barely, but enough for Morgan to see it. The store was dead silent now. The weight of the question hung between them, heavy and unshakable. For a long moment, James just stared, his fingers still gripping the baby formula like a last shred of control. His jaw worked, his mind racing for something, anything to throw back. But nothing came. Morgan tilted his head slightly. "I know men like you," he said, his voice like slow thunder. "You think power comes from making people feel small. But real power?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "It's what you do when nobody's watching." James swallowed. The confidence, the arrogance, it was cracking. The customers weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. And suddenly, for the first time in years, James wasn't sure if he liked who he had become. James' grip on the formula loosened, but he didn't let go. Something in Morgan's words had struck a nerve. His breathing was shallow, his face tense. For the first time, he wasn't in control, not of the store, not of himself. Morgan took another step forward, his eyes steady. "You weren't always like this, were you?" His voice was softer now, like he was speaking to something buried deep. James's eyes flickered with something, recognition. His knuckles whitened around the formula, but his face wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to fear. Morgan nodded slowly. He knew. And James, for the first time, saw it too. James' breath hitched. His eyes flickered, not with anger, but with something rawer. Recognition. Morgan watched the shift happen, slow and painful, like a wound being reopened. "You remember me, don't you?" James's fingers trembled around the formula. His lips parted, but no words came out. He did remember. A long time ago, when he was just a boy, a scared, lonely boy, someone had stepped in when no one else had. Morgan Freeman wasn't just a stranger in his store. He was the man who had once saved him. James felt the room closing in, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his back. He wasn't standing in the supermarket anymore. He was 8 years, old, rain-soaked and shaking, standing outside a diner he wasn't allowed into. A man had come out, placed a warm coat over his shoulders, and given him a meal, no questions asked. Morgan saw the shift in James' eyes and nodded. "I didn't. Think you'd remember." His voice carried no judgment, just quiet understanding. The past had a way of slipping through cracks, but kindness, real kindness, left a mark. James gritted his teeth, his fingers gripping the baby formula like an anchor. "That was a long time ago." His voice was rough, but it wasn't steady anymore. The walls he had built, the armor he had worn, they weren't holding like they used to. Morgan exhaled, a small, knowing smile forming. "It was?" His eyes flicked to the formula still in James' hand. "But tell me, did it matter?" James let out a sharp breath, his grip tightening on the can of formula. "It doesn't matter," he muttered, but the words felt hollow. His past wasn't supposed to follow him here. He had buried it, built a life where he was the one in control, not the scared kid, not the one who needed help. Morgan didn't press, didn't push. He simply watched. You can tell yourself that. His voice was patient, steady. But if it didn't matter, you wouldn't remember. The truth sat between them, heavy and undeniable. The store was utterly silent now. The customers, the other employees, they weren't just watching a conflict anymore. They were witnessing something deeper, something personal. Even Danielle, still holding her child, hadn't moved. James's jaw clenched. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to push Morgan away. But for the first time in years, he couldn't find the words. James' chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. He wanted to fight this, to push back, to make Morgan the enemy. But no matter how hard he tried, the past wouldn't stay buried. He was that boy again, cold, hungry, waiting for someone to notice. His fingers slackened, and the formula slipped from his grip, landing on the counter with a soft thud. The sound echoed louder than it should have, like a surrender. His hands flexed uselessly at his sides, fists curling and uncurling. Everything he had built, his identity, his defenses, was crumbling. Morgan didn't gloat. He just stood there, waiting. The patience in his gaze wasn't pity, wasn't judgment. It was the same look he had given James all those years ago. A look that said, "You don't have to be this." James swallowed hard. His eyes flickered around the store, at the people watching, at Danielle holding her child, at the formula on the counter, and then, finally, at Morgan. His voice came out hoarse. "What do you want from me?" Morgan let the question hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on James more than any accusation ever could. Then finally he spoke. "Nothing?" His voice was soft, certain. "This isn't about me." James blinked, caught off guard. He had been ready for a lecture, for shame, for some grand act of righteousness, but Morgan wasn't asking for anything. He had already given James everything he needed, the choice. Danielle shifted, watching the scene unfold with wide, wary eyes. Her child nestled against her, oblivious to the storm raging in the man across from them. The store, the people. They weren't waiting for Morgan anymore. They were waiting for James. His throat tightened. The question wasn't, what does Morgan want? It was, who am I going to be? James's breath was uneven, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had spent years building walls, making himself untouchable. But now, standing in front of Morgan, in front of all these people, he felt exposed. His gaze dropped to the formula on the counter. It was such a small thing, just a can, just a choice. But it wasn't, and he knew it. This moment would define him. Would he cling to his bitterness, his need for control? Or would he let go? Slowly, his fingers twitched. Then, with a sharp inhale, he picked up the formula. Not to hoard it, not to weaponize it, but to scan it. The register beeped, breaking the thick silence. Morgan didn't smile, didn't nod in approval. He just watched. Because the choice had never been about him, it had always been about James. James moved like a man walking through a dream, unsure, unsteady, but moving forward anyway. He placed the formula in Danielle's bag, avoiding her eyes. No words. No grand gesture, just an action that spoke louder than anything he could say. Danielle hesitated, as if waiting for the cruelty to return, for the trap to snap shut. But it didn't. Her fingers closed around the bag, holding it tight, holding back tears. She nodded once, a silent thank you. James swallowed hard and turned to Morgan. His throat was tight, but he forced the words out. "That all for you, sir?" It was stiff, almost awkward, but it wasn't laced with venom anymore. Morgan held his gaze for a long moment, then set the pack of gum on the counter again. "That's all." James rang up the gum, hand steady, for the first time that day. But his mind was spinning. Why had Morgan come here? Why today? It couldn't just be coincidence. It felt too deliberate. Morgan slid a few bills across the counter and met James's eyes. "I came to see what became of you." The words were simple, but they hit like a tidal wave. This wasn't an accident. James's breath caught in his throat. Morgan had remembered him. After all these years, after a fleeting moment of kindness in the past, Morgan had wondered. His fingers hovered over the change, but his mind was elsewhere. What did Morgan see in him now? And more importantly, what did he see in himself? James gripped the edge of the counter, his mind racing. Morgan had come back for him, not to humiliate him, not to punish him, but to see him, to remind him of the boy he had once been. He exhaled slowly, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. How many choices had led him here? How many moments had shaped the man he had become? And now, standing here, he realized this was one of those moments, too. Danielle adjusted her grip on her child, watching James carefully. She had been waiting for cruelty, but instead she had witnessed something else, something she never thought she'd see. Morgan took his change, slipping it into his pocket. He gave James a final look, one that didn't judge or condemn, but simply saw. And for the first time in years, James let himself be seen. Morgan turned, walking toward the door with the same unshakable calm he had carried all along. The store was still quiet, the weight of the moment lingering in the air. No one would forget what had just happened. James watched him go, something heavy settling in his chest. He looked down at his hands, hands that had once clenched with control, with bitterness, but now they felt lighter. Danielle adjusted her child, giving James one last glance before leaving. He had been the villain in her story today, but maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be in someone else's tomorrow. The chime of the door rang as Morgan stepped outside. James exhaled, rubbing his face. He didn't know what kind of man he would be tomorrow, but today, for the first time in a long time, he had made the right choice. A simple act of kindness changed everything, but how many moments like this go unnoticed every day? How many people are left fighting battles they never should have to face alone? If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of second chances. And if you love stories about redemption, justice, and the unexpected strength of human kindness, stick around, because we're just getting started.